She lived alone, but one day she took in a strange kitten. He grew quickly, too quickly, and when thieves broke into the house, it became clear this was no ordinary cat. A story of kindness and loyalty, and of a wild predator who found a home. Watch till the end, you won't forget this tale. The village of Hilford stretched across gentle hills, drenched in greenery in summer and blanketed by thick snowdrifts in winter. On its very edge, where the last cottages nearly vanished into thickets of bird, cherry and alder, stood an old log house with sagging shutters and a creaky porch that groaned under every step. Its walls, darkened by years of wind and rain, still held the warmth of the stove and the mingled aromas of dried mushrooms, mint, milk and freshly baked bread. Here lived Granny Agnes, the last of the Cowley family in these parts. Once, the house had been full of laughter, clattering dishes and the heavy tread of her husband's boots. But the years had taken it all. The children grew up and moved to cities. Her husband died of an illness neither country remedies nor city doctors could cure. Grandchildren rarely called and visited even less. Life in the city moved faster than it did here, where time flowed slowly, like honey from an upturned jar. Now, her only companions were cats. Every morning, Granny Agnes began the day by filling 5 bowls, a bit of fish for Toby, porridge with milk for Mittens and Daisy, the same meal as hers for Whiskers, and for Smokey, softened bread in warm broth, because his teeth no longer allowed hard food. After breakfast, she made her rounds, checking that everything was in its place. In the evenings, she sat in her chair by the stove, knitting or reading an old book, and began telling stories to the cats. Stories of how the house used to smell of pies on Sundays, of how the children once ran across the yard, of how her husband built the furniture still standing in the corner. The cats listened. Some dozed, some sat beside her, their yellow or green eyes fixed on her. "You're good listeners," she would say, stroking one behind the ear, "not like people who've forgotten this old lady." But what she missed most was the sound of children's laughter. She often found herself talking aloud to those who were no longer there, to the husband she buried in a downpour, the rain so heavy they had to carry the coffin through torrents, to the daughter who moved to the city and hadn't called in 3 months, to the grandson who once played in this very yard but no longer replied to her messages. The house was full of shadows from the past. But one autumn day, while cold rain tapped on the roof and wind chased golden leaves through the streets, a faint, pitiful squeak echoed from beneath the porch. Autumn always came slowly to Hilford. First, the birch leaves turned yellow at the edges, then gray clouds hung low over the forest, and before long, Granny Agnes had to stoke the stove not only in the evenings, but early in the morning as well. That day, the rain had started before noon, a fine, persistent drizzle that turned the earth into thick black sludge. Granny had come home late from the market, her shopping bag heavy with bread and supplies, and the footpath to her house so muddy that each step was a struggle. She had nearly reached the gate when she stopped. Through the sound of the rain came a soft, pitiful cry. She frowned, set her bags down on the porch, and listened carefully. The sound came again, from somewhere below. She bent down and pushed aside the wet boards that shielded the space beneath the porch from the wind and froze. There in the dark on the damp ground sat a tiny gray bundle, a kitten so filthy and soaked it was impossible to tell its true fur color. It was shivering, cowering in the corner, staring up at her with enormous yellow eyes that seemed to ask, "Will you take me in?" "Oh my goodness," whispered Agnes. She reached out, expecting the kitten to hiss or flee, but it did neither. It leaned toward her fingers, pressed its nose into her palm, and gave another desperate squeak. She gently scooped it up. The kitten was light as a feather and cold to the touch. It immediately curled against her chest, as if seeking the last warm place on earth. "Come on, little one," she murmured. "Let's get you inside." The house was quiet. The cats were napping, Toby on the stove, Mittens on the windowsill, the others tucked into their favorite corners. Only Smokey lifted his head, catching the unfamiliar scent, and stared at her. She wrapped the kitten in an old cloth, dried him off, then found a cleaner towel and carefully rubbed his cold little body. Beneath the dirt, the fur wasn't just gray. It had a peculiar silvery hue, with dark rings on the tail and faint stripes on the legs. "You're something special, aren't you?" she muttered. The kitten sneezed, stretched, and nudged her hand with his nose. "Hungry?" she asked. She warmed up some milk, poured it into a shallow dish, and placed it in front of him. At first, he sniffed cautiously. Then, afraid it might be taken away, he pounced on the milk, gulping it down so greedily that he coughed. "Poor thing, you haven't eaten in ages," she sighed. When he finished, she picked him up and examined him. Ears intact, eyes clear, paws undamaged, just small, hungry, and terribly alone. "Where's your mother, she asked aloud. In response, the kitten purred, faintly, just barely, but it was the first sound he made that wasn't out of fear or hunger. It was a sound of contentment. "All right then," she said, "you can stay, for now." She made him a temporary bed out of an old basket and a warm blanket. But the moment she set him down, he climbed right back out and toddled after her on wobbly legs. She took a step. He followed. When she stopped, he sat at her feet, staring up with those golden eyes. "What a stubborn little soul," she laughed. She picked him up, and the kitten immediately nestled into her chest, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. The next morning, the other cats discovered their new housemate. Toby was the first to approach, tail held high with importance. He sniffed the kitten, snorted, and walked away, clearly unimpressed. Mittens hissed from around the corner. Daisy cautiously sniffed the newcomer, then lost interest. Surprisingly, Whiskers, usually the grumpiest, showed unexpected tolerance. He simply gave the kitten a lick on the ear and walked off. Smokey approached last. He stared at the kitten for a long moment, then lay down beside him and began gently licking his back. "See," said Agnes, stroking Smokey's head, "you're not alone anymore." The kitten, whom she had already begun calling Sammy in her mind, seemed to understand. He rubbed his little face against her palm and purred. A week passed, then another. Sammy was growing at an astonishing rate. He turned out to be incredibly ravenous. He devoured everything given to him and immediately begged for more. His fur, now clean and fluffy, shimmered with a silver sheen. Dark spots had appeared on his chest and legs, like those of a baby leopard. But what amazed Agnes most were his eyes, large, round, bright yellow, with narrow vertical pupils. They didn't just watch, they seemed to see, to understand. "You're something else," she'd say, scratching behind his ears. Sammy would purr, then climb into her lap and curl up to sleep. Another month passed, and Sammy outgrew all the other cats. His paws became thick and heavy, his tail wide and bushy, and his gaze somehow deeper, more intense. Neighbors who came by for herbs or a friendly chat would shake their heads. "That's no house cat," muttered old Mr. Nichols, squinting at Sammy. "Looks like one of them Maine Coons, or maybe some wild forest beast." "Just a cat," Agnes would reply, waving him off. But sometimes even she found herself wondering. Sammy didn't chase yarn or sunbeams, didn't wrestle with Toby for the warm spot on the stove. He mostly observed, sitting by the window, staring out at the forest, or he followed her silently, step for step, like a shadow, like a guardian. One day, when she slipped on the wet floor and nearly fell, Sammy was there in an instant. He didn't meow, he didn't panic. He just looked into her eyes, deeply, searchingly. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking his head. Sammy let out a low, rumbling purr and rubbed his cheek against her hand. That evening, when she lay down to sleep, he curled up by her feet as usual. But before settling, he stared at her for a long time with those glowing yellow eyes, as if trying to say something. Winter arrived in Hilford unexpectedly. One morning, Granny Agnes awoke to an eerie silence. Outside, thick snow blanketed everything, swallowing sound. Only the faint prints of bird feet marked the pristine white sheet covering the yard. Inside, the house was warm, the stove crackled softly, and the cats still dozed in their cozy corners. All except Sammy. He sat at the window, still as a statue, staring into the forest. His yellow eyes seemed to pierce through the trees, as if he were seeing something invisible to human eyes. "What are you watching out there?" Agnes asked, stepping up beside him. Sammy slowly turned his head toward her, looked for a moment, then returned his gaze to the woods. She sighed and went about her morning tasks, filling bowls, adding logs to the fire, making tea. The other cats began waking up, stretching and moving toward their food. The ginger cat, Toby, sat on the stove, eyes fixed on Sammy. His fur was bristled, ears pinned back, tail twitching. "Toby, come eat!" Agnes called, but he didn't move. He just gave a low growl when Sammy finally walked away from the window and approached the food bowls. "What's gotten into all of you today?" she muttered. It wasn't just Toby. Mittens wouldn't touch her food until Sammy had walked away. Daisy shrank back when he passed by. Even gentle Smokey seemed unusually tense, watching Sammy with wary eyes. "Did you all make some secret pact?" she said, with a half laugh, half concern. But Sammy didn't seem to notice or care. He ate calmly without rushing. When he finished, he rubbed against her leg, then curled up near the stove, his thick tail wrapping around him like a blanket. The days went by, but the strange behavior only deepened. The other cats avoided him. If Sammy lay on the stove, Toby moved to the windowsill. If he walked into a room, Daisy would slink out. Even usually unbothered Whiskers preferred to keep his distance. Agnes started noticing other oddities. Sammy never meowed. He could purr, low, deep, like a distant engine, but he never made the usual cat sounds. His movements were eerily smooth, nearly silent, even when running. Sometimes she caught herself thinking he looked at her, not like a pet looks at its owner, but like an equal, like someone who understood every word. "Bring me the yarn," she once said out loud, half joking. Sammy raised his head, glanced at the basket in the corner, then at her. He didn't move. "Well," she chuckled, "maybe not." But later that evening, when she had a coughing fit and stood up shakily from her chair, Sammy was instantly beside her, bracing himself against her legs as if to steady her. His eyes searched her face, wide and anxious. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she whispered, patting his head. "Old age isn't a sickness." He purred, but his pupils remained thin and alert. Even the neighbors began noticing things. "Agnes?" asked Mrs. Martha one day, peeking through the door. "What kind of creature do you have in here? It's like a cat, but not quite." "Just a cat," she replied, brushing the question aside. "What kind of cat?" muttered old Mr. Nichols, still doubtful. "Look at those paws like paddles, that tail like a chimney brush, and those eyes like an owl's." Sammy would sit quietly during such visits, unmoving except for a twitch of his ears. And when the guests left, he'd walk over to Agnes and nuzzle her hand, as if to say, "Don't listen to them." "I don't care what you are," she'd whisper, stroking behind his ear. "You're mine. That's what matters." But one night, Agnes was awakened by a strange sound, a low, growling rustle coming from outside. She sat up in bed. Sammy wasn't beside her. She crept to the window, pulled back the curtain, and froze. There, in the moonlit yard, stood Sammy, his back arched. His fur bristled, his tail fluffed up like a bottle brush, and a low, harsh growl rumbled from deep in his throat. It wasn't a hiss, it was more like the warning snarl of a wild animal. Across from him, just a few feet away, crouched a large fox, red-furred, black-legged, baring its teeth in a vicious snarl. A fox that usually didn't fear even dogs was backing away. Sammy stepped forward. The fox leapt back. Another step, and the fox turned, bolting into the darkness. Sammy stared after it a few seconds more, then slowly turned toward the house. Agnes rushed back to bed. When the door creaked and heavy steps padded across the floor, she closed her eyes and pretended to sleep. Sammy paused beside her, gently licked her hand, and curled up at her feet. "You're no house cat," she thought silently. Outside, the wind stirred the snow, as if trying to erase the strange tracks of the night. In the morning, she studied him carefully in the light. His fur was thicker than that of her other cats, the undercoat dense like a wild animal's. His ears were rounder with tiny tufts. And those eyes, not quite like any cat's she had known. That winter, Hilford was uneasy. First, old Nichols lost a chicken. Then, Martha's pantry was raided, her food stores mysteriously vanished. Neighbors whispered about a pack of strays or maybe a lone wolf from the forest. But no tracks were found. Only snow, oddly smooth, as though someone had carefully swept away the evidence. Granny Agnes listened to the chatter while sipping tea by the stove, occasionally glancing at Sammy curled at her feet. He was fast asleep, or pretending to be. "You should go out more," she muttered, scratching his head. "You're getting spoiled, lying there like a prince." Sammy cracked one eye open, looked at her with a mix of amusement and accusation, then shut it again. But each night, when she went to bed, he slipped out into the dark, quiet as a shadow. She'd hear the soft crunch of snow under heavy paws. And in the morning, she'd find odd little gifts on her porch. A rabbit, a grouse. "You're quite the hunter," she'd say, shaking her head at yet another offering. Sammy would sit proudly nearby, grooming his paw with dignity. That night, Agnes woke to a silence that felt wrong. Even the stove wasn't crackling, no rustling paws on the floor, no gentle purring from the foot of the bed. "Sammy?" she whispered into the dark. No answer. She was about to get up when she heard it, the faint creak of the door. Not the usual groan of old hinges, but a careful, deliberate sound. Someone testing it. She froze. In Hilford, no one locked their doors. What for? Everyone knew everyone. But now, her fingers instinctively reached for the hatchet she kept near the stove. Another creak. Then a light knock. Quiet. Probing. As if someone was feeling for the weak point. And then a growl. Low, guttural, not of a cat, but something far more dangerous. It rumbled like a bear's snarl, so deep it made the window panes tremble. Agnes sprang to her feet. Outside the door, chaos erupted. A cry, then footsteps, then a scream, followed by a blood-curdling roar that shook the walls. She threw the door open. On the porch, under a pale moon, two large men in dark clothing were flailing in the snow. One was scrambling backward, covering his face. The other swung a knife wildly, panic in his eyes. Between them stood Sammy. But it wasn't the Sammy who slept on her pillow. His fur stood on end, doubling his size. His eyes blazed like lanterns. From his open mouth, sharp, white fangs gleamed, too long for any house cat. He didn't hiss, he roared, each sound like a lash of thunder. The second man raised the knife. Sammy moved, not in a leap, but with a strange gliding lunge. The knife sliced the air, too slow. A scream tore through the night. Agnes saw dark droplets hit the snow. "Run!" one man shouted. They stumbled off into the woods, leaving behind deep crimson streaks in the snow. Sammy stood there for a moment, his fur slowly lowering, his chest heaving. "Come inside," Agnes said, her voice shaking. He stepped over the threshold. And in that instant, all the strength seemed to leave him. He staggered. Agnes rushed forward and caught him, easing him gently to the floor. "You fool," she whispered, holding him close. "You could have been killed." Sammy nudged her hand weakly. By morning, the village was buzzing. 2 strangers had been found near the road, one with his face torn, the other with deep claw marks on his arms. They mumbled nonsense about a devil cat, a monstrous beast that had attacked them. Old Mr. Nichols stood on Agnes's porch, twisting his cap in his hands. "They say, you've got some kind of wild animal here." "A cat," she said calmly. "What kind of cat?" "A cat," she repeated, firm. Nichols glanced past her into the dim room, where 2 glowing yellow eyes blinked from the shadows. He backed away quickly. "Well, just be careful." Once he left, Agnes shut the door and turned around. Sammy was sitting in the middle of the room, licking his paw. A dark scab marked his chest, a wound not deep, but still raw. "Come here," she said gently. He padded over and she wiped the dried blood from his fur with a warm, damp cloth. "Fool," she muttered again. Sammy purred low and nudged her shoulder with his head. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, revealing muddy roads and the first green shoots by Agnes's porch. But despite the sun and blooming earth, a strange tension lingered in Hilford. After the attack, people spoke openly. "That's no cat," muttered Nichols outside the corner store. "That's a wild predator. I've seen one in the zoo. They're called manals. Vicious. Can kill a man, they say." "Oh, come on," Martha replied, though doubt crept into her voice. "He protected her, didn't he?" Agnes heard it all, but didn't respond. She sat quietly, patching an old sweater and watching Sammy nap on the floor, stretched out full length. Sunlight spilled across his thick silver coat, catching the dark rings on his tail and the massive paws tipped with long claws. Yes, he wasn't just any cat. "What are you really?" she asked softly. Sammy turned his head and met her gaze with those glowing yellow eyes. In them was no malice, no wildness, just calm understanding. The very next day, a veterinarian arrived in Hilford from the district center, a tall, thin man in glasses. The locals wasted no time leading him to Agnes's cottage. "You here to see Miss Agnes?" called out a neighbor boy. "She's got a real beast in there." The vet chuckled. "Let's go meet this beast, then." Agnes met him on the porch, arms crossed. "What do you want?" "I've been told there's a wild animal living here," the vet said politely. "I need to make sure it's not dangerous." "Dangerous or not, he's mine," Agnes snapped. But she stepped aside and let him in. Sammy was sitting calmly by the stove. At first glance, the vet froze. He slowly took off his glasses, cleaned them, and looked again. "That's a Pallas's cat," he finally said. "A manule, a wild steppe feline. They don't live anywhere near here. The nearest known habitat is over 1,000 kilometers away." Agnes said nothing, just watched as the vet cautiously approached. But Sammy didn't hiss or run. He sat still, staring back with that heavy, intelligent gaze. "Incredible," the vet murmured, kneeling. "Fully grown male, perfect health. How on earth did he end up here?" "Found him in the rain," Agnes said flatly. "He belongs in a sanctuary, or a reserve. He's a protected species, listed as vulnerable." Sammy suddenly turned his head and locked eyes with the vet. The man flinched, taking a step back. "You see?" said Agnes, voice steady. "He doesn't want to go. He's mine. I raised him, fed him. If he ever leaves, it'll be because he chooses to." The vet opened his mouth to reply, but Sammy's eyes held him quiet. After a moment, he silently packed his bag. "All right," he said on his way out. "But be careful. He's still a wild animal." "He's not wild," Agnes replied, holding the door. "Not anymore." That evening, she sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Sammy lay beside her, resting his heavy head on her knees. "So, you're rare, are you?" she said, scratching behind his ears. Sammy purred, deep and slow, like distant thunder. Then he lifted his head, looked into her eyes, and slowly, deliberately, touched his nose to her wrinkled cheek. Agnes laughed. "What a strange creature you are." And in Hilford, a new story took root. Of the old woman who tamed a wild predator. Neighbors passed her gate with a little more respect now. Children would toss scraps of meat into her yard, not for the cats but for the cat. Sammy accepted their offerings but never ate them in front of people. He'd carry the meat inside, for Agnes. Spring passed into summer. One morning, Agnes woke to an unusual stillness. Sammy wasn't at his usual spot by the door. "Sammy?" She stepped outside and spotted a familiar shape sitting at the edge of the forest on a sunlit hilltop. He wasn't looking at the village or the house, but far, far beyond, into the wild, open lands beyond the trees. She walked over and sat beside him. "You thinking of going, my boy?" she asked softly. He turned his head, looked at her. In his eyes, there was no sadness, just understanding. She stroked his back. "If you want to go, go." Sammy closed his eyes and pressed his head gently into her hand. Then he stood, stretched, and began walking toward the forest. Agnes watched him reach the edge of the trees. He stopped, turned. She nodded. "You're free." He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned again and vanished into the green. She sighed, adjusted her shawl, and walked back to the house. But that evening, as she sat on the porch with her tea, a familiar gray shape emerged from the shadows. Sammy walked up, dropped a freshly caught rabbit at her feet, and lay down beside her, as if nothing had changed. Agnes laughed, brushing a hand over his head. He wasn't just a cat, not just a beast. He was the one who, long ago, heard a call of kindness in the rain and stayed for good. Sammy remained by Granny Agnes's side. Each morning he greeted her with a soft purr, and each night he warmed her feet with his thick coat. He wasn't just a cat, or even just a wild creature. He had become part of her heart, loyal, protective, real. And it had all started with one small, shivering bundle under the rain.